poverty reduction is happening in Colombia. And inequality, for the first time, the fight against inequality is showing some results. Very recently, some of the world experts that calculate the Gini coefficient for several countries allowed finally to, or better show it that Colombia has been removed from the list of the 10 most unequal nations. And I think that's very important to continue on that road. Second, President Santos has launched a campaign to enhance the presence and the peaceful influence of Colombia in the region. We are historically a very fiercey country, if I can say it like that, among ourselves. We have been very much a peaceful and a contributor to peace and stability at the international arena for a long, long time. So we're trying to do that, understanding that we're in a region that is complex, that is difficult, that is not so easy nowadays, but that the best answer is to find channels of what we have in common, and not only to, push the differences that are evident. We are different from many of the conditions and situations that are happening in Latin America. But we cannot just change those by saying we will. We have to find ways. We are promoting cooperation in security. We are promoting the Pacific Alliance. And quote me if you want, Pacific Alliance is going to be one of the most important efforts, not only in economic, but in political terms in Latin America. It will include, in economic terms and development, part of Latin America into the Pacific and Asia basin. I think that's huge, and that's going to be a very interesting opportunity of development, investment, growth, and hopefully poverty reduction and inequality reduction. But at the same time has become a political concept. A political concept that opposes to current new quote-unquote ways of democracy, that opposes somehow what we're seeing in other countries of the region. The alliance between Mexico, Chile, Peru, Colombia, and maybe others that will join in the following years, I think is a good response to those countries that want prosperity, peaceful development, at the same time trade with the most successful countries in the world, but in a peaceful and effective way. Let me end with my final line. The other element that has been included onto this strategy certainly is a peace dialogue. For those of us who have been studying or following the history of warfare and the history of insurgency warfare, most of these wars will end in a peace table, in a peace negotiation. It's not a matter of if I like it or not, it's a fact. What is important is on what conditions. In Colombia, this is not the first time, this is the fourth time. 4 times we have gone to try to end the conflict with the FARC through a peace negotiation. And the 3 previous have failed. Have failed because in those times, maybe Colombia's state was not as strong as it is now. Maybe because we were not defeating the terrorism as we have been defeating the terrorism. And maybe because we didn't have the political strength to set some conditions. Of course, the debate is high. It's high in the Colombian society. It's very important inside the government. Of course, the discussion on impunity is an issue everybody cares. But for a society that has almost 50 years in conflict, those are questions that sooner or later we will have to confront. Is in this peace process, or we will have to confront those questions anytime in the future. I think that we are right now stronger than ever. The armed forces continue to be strengthened. The economy continues to prosper. And the Colombian society feels that anyhow we want peace, not necessarily we want the conditions or anyone will set conditions for the Colombian people. The debate is open. Of course, President Santos has stated clearly that he will not cede on certain elements, that he will not concede changes in the fundamentals of the Colombian democracy, in the fundamentals of the Colombian concepts related to private property, to the economy, to the armed forces, to what I would call the fundamentals. So I hope the FARC understands that if they don't get on board now, they might never get on board. I hope they understand that we will keep pressuring them with all our capacity, with all legitimacy, with all decisiveness. That's what we will continue to do. If they can understand, go away from their terrorist activity, but at the same time, from drug trafficking, from childhood recruitment, from all kinds of violations, these will make sense. In our side, in our case, we will continue to strengthen institutions to guarantee that those failures of the past in which members of our armed forces misbehave are well taken by justice, are well studied, and are not repeated. And if someone misbehaves, we have the right kind of justice, military and ordinary justice, to be able to respond to the conditions and the situations that happen. I know I took much longer than I was supposed, but you know the good news? That I had a presentation for something like 2 hours. You know? So the good news is I was able to summarize the story as brief as I could. Thank you for the opportunity, and as I said before, I think we have a holistic, broader strategy. All the concepts are in place. We will pursue to reach our objectives, but in the case specific of the peace dialogue, I think that the most important message is we will reach to peace in Colombia through reason, or as we have been doing it, through the conviction of legitimacy and the legitimate use of force to protect the Colombian people and to enhance their rights. Thank you very much.
Professor Robbins, the floor is yours.
Okay. Thank you. So that's very optimistic interpretation of what's been going on in Colombia, and I hope the Minister is totally right. I'm very used, however, to positive, optimistic interpretations of Colombia. In fact, when I first went to Colombia, it was recently 3 presidential candidates had been assassinated in the late 1980s, and I was lectured endlessly about how, you see, don't get confused between Colombia and other Latin American countries, because Colombia is a really successful country. It has a long history of democracy, it has very good economic policy, it doesn't have a debt crisis, it doesn't have inflation. This is not like these other unserious Latin American countries. And in the 1990s, as the paramilitaries and the guerrilla expanded, and as they fixed elections, and as more people were murdered and kidnapped, I still was endlessly lectured on what a successful country this was. So I think we have to kind of normalize by the usual Colombian level of optimism. And I think this might be right, but let me try to be skeptical about what might not be right. And let me start kind of my skepticism by asking, where do all these problems in Colombia come from? This violence and kidnapping and coca and things like that. Is it the drugs? Is it sort of intrinsically the drugs? Or is it the guerrilla? Is it the FARC that causes all the problems? So if we can just get the FARC to demobilize, everything's going to be okay and all the problems will be solved. Well, I think the FARC and the drug economy are symptoms of Colombia's problems, not the cause. The Venezuelans discovered oil under Lake Maracaibo. The Colombians didn't discover coca under Guatavita. They went to Peru and Bolivia and they brought it to Colombia. Okay? The Colombians selected into the drug industry, to use the language of economics. It just didn't happen. It came to Colombia for a very good reason. And why is it that Colombia has this long-running, intractable problem with the guerrilla? That's also not a coincidence either, okay? So I'd like to say, I want to start by talking about the kind of fundamentals which the Minister talked about towards the end. And I think that's a very good discussion, but I'm not going to start by talking about inequality, but I want to start talking about how the state is organized. It seems to me that if you want to understand where all these problems in Colombia come from, you have to understand the architecture of the state and how historically, and possibly even today, the state just hasn't been capable or interested in exercising its authority in huge parts of the country. So I'm going to come back to asking whether this has changed or not. So I think this is fundamentally about the architecture of the state and the relationship between, you know, what social scientists might call the sort of the core of the country, places like Bogota, where lots of things work very well, and the periphery of the country, in the east, in the Caribbean coast, in Urabá, in Choco, in Caquetá, or wherever it is, where the state doesn't do very much at all. So I think this is the fundamental origin of all these problems, the vacuum of authority in the periphery in Colombia. Now, why is there a vacuum of authority? Why doesn't the state exercise its authority in these areas? I think that's fundamentally a political issue. It's not an engineering problem. Okay, I always like the great remark of the Colombian writer R.H. Moreno Duran on this topic, where he said, you know, the problem in Colombia is that politics corrupts drug dealing. Now, that's a very deep remark, in my opinion. Okay? So I want to talk a little bit about how politics corrupts drug dealing and how politics works more fundamentally to sustain this vacuum of authority in rural Colombia. And I want to ask about the last 10 years and ask whether or not there's been a process which has really changed that dynamic in rural Colombia, because I think that's where all these problems come from. And, you know, so let me illustrate what I mean by this with an example. So I'm not going to talk about lots of different social science theories about what might drive this vacuum of authority and why it's so persistent over time. So, you know, the Colombian state has been staggeringly small until the 1990s, until the constitutional rewrite in 1991 led to a large expansion of the state. If you go back to the 1970, taxes were about 6% of national income. You know, the Colombians had a state which was smaller than Sierra Leone or places in West Africa in the 1960s and 1970s. This was a very small state with very few resources, okay? But the fact that the state was very small and had very few resources is not a technical issue. It's about politics. It's about the politics of the construction of the state, the construction of the fiscal system, the construction of institutions. So that means that the solution is a fundamentally political one. So let me give you a little example of, you know, how this might work, and, you know, to try to convince you that this story about the absence of state authority is correct. So this is a relatively contemporary story, and then I'll try to ask, you know, is there a historical dimension to this? Is just this something that has been thrust upon the Colombians in the last 10 or 20 years, or does it reflect some much more deep-seated problem in society? And I'm going to try to argue it does. So, for example, I've been studying the Autodefensas Campesinas del Magdalena Medio. So this is one of the paramilitary groups that demobilized in Colombia in 2006. So this paramilitary group was started in 1977 by a gentleman called Ramón Izaza. And it was started in 1977 because he was just sick of being harassed by the guerrilla. So the FARC started a new front in the east of Antioquia in the middle of the 1970s, which started taxing people, kidnapping people, making people pay the vacuna. So Izaza just had enough. And he formed a group, first group called Los Escopeteros, 10 guys with shotguns to try to go into the mountain and fight the FARC. So he got more money, he got more guns, he got into cohabitation with big landowners and other nascent paramilitary groups in Puerto Boyacá. He got bigger and bigger and bigger. At the time of demobilization, they probably had about 3,000 men under arms, and they had a remarkable organization in that part of Colombia. Let me tell you about this organization. They had 6 fronts within the group, and they did all sorts of things. They had functional specialization in the bureaucracy. They had tax collectors. They had a fiscal wing. They had a political wing. They had a military wing with a command structure. They raised taxes. They taxed all the landowners and businessmen. They taxed the people who smuggled petrol, the cartel de gasolina. They taxed the drug dealers. They built roads. They built schools. They built houses for poor people. They built Plaza de Toros. They built sports stadiums. They built electrification programs. They had estatutos. You know, they had a sort of nascent legal system. They were the state. They were the state. Okay, that's the point. Where was the state? Well, the state was sort of around. You know, there was some police and soldiers in some parts, but the state, in some sense, accepted the authority of these groups. In fact, I have a friend who's a policeman who told me that that they had to ask permission to Ramón Izaza to enter his territory if they wanted to pick up a corpse. Okay, so in 2001 there was a famous meeting in Santa Fe de Ralito between Jorge Quarenta, Don Berna, Salvatore Mancuso, Diego Vecino, and a whole bunch of politicians, senators, congressmen, governors, mayors. They all got together and they signed a pact, which I'm sure everybody knows about, to demand the refounding of the country. Okay, now you may think this is sort of something deeply anomalous in Colombia, but actually I think it's very symptomatic of the order in rural Colombia, that national politicians had no problem in getting together with Mancuso and Jorge Quarenta and discussing Colombia's future. That was fine. Now, in Ramón Izaza's territory, one of the fronts was based in La Dorada. La Dorada was the political base of a famous national politician, Victor Hernán Barco. How did they interact with Victor Hernán Barco? Well, Victor Hernán Barco got the Autodefensas to fix elections for him. Now, that's a very interesting guy, because in the national level, Victor Hernán Barco was known, you know, if you met him in Bogota, he'd have been carrying the Financial Times or the Economist. You know, he was known as the nemesis of the Minister of Finance, because he was such a strong force in favor of good macroeconomic policy. Now, how is it that these two worlds coincide? You know, so as a social scientist, or coexist, as a social scientist, I'm really fascinated by the kind of symbiotic relationship between these two worlds and how it is that they can persist in a sort of equilibrium for such a long period of time. I'm going to talk about that in a second. Okay? Now, you can think, you know, I know you're an ex-economist, you know, so you can think of lots of different theories of how these things work. You know, it could be that because, you know, if you have this mechanism at the local level for winning elections, then you don't need to engage in populism. So that means at a national level you can actually engage in sensible economic policy because you don't need to engage in populism to win elections. So that, you know, there's an example of a kind of mechanism which allows these two things to kind of coexist, and you can think of other ones. I just wanted to give you one very specific example of this kind of coexistence. You know, it's like the famous remark about, I can't remember who made this remark, but I think about President Barco. I can't remember who made this remark, but somebody made this remark that President Barco, when he was in Bogota, he was a technocrat, but when he was in Cucuta, he was a manzanillo. And that sort of says, I think it was Alberto Lleras who said that, this kind of sums up everything about this kind of the coexistence of these two spheres. And I think this reflects the organization of the state. Now you might say, okay, fine, but maybe this is just something really recent and it's just some catastrophe that's appeared out of nowhere, and once we get rid of it, everything's going to be fine. But I don't think that's true. You know, if you go back to the 1950s and 1960s, there's lots of examples of people like Ramon y Saza. There was a gentleman called Duma Alcure. Duma Alcure was a liberal guerrillero in the 1950s. He was a general in the army of Guadalupe Salcedo during the Violencia. And in 1953, he set himself up in Meta. And he ruled Meta for about 15 years until 1968. He raised taxes, he built roads, he was the state. He fixed elections too. His mistake was in 1968, he backed the wrong side in Villavicencio. And his guy lost, and the winner sent in the army after him. If you look at how he operated, he was a sort of nascent Ramon y Saza. Okay? Now, I understand that there has been a state-building project, but there have been lots of state-building projects in the past in Colombia. In fact, the National Front was a state-building project. So people just think the National Front was a sort of, the two parties split everything 50-50, but it was much more than that. It was also a state-building project. It was a project to stabilize the rural area, the rural society. That's what agrarian reform was about. It was a project to kind of reconstruct the authority of the state in large parts of the country where it had collapsed in the 1950s. It was a complete failure. In fact, by 1965, the government was already passing laws to facilitate the creation of armed self-defense groups. What was that in 1965? In 1965, the FARC and the ELN had what? A couple of hundred people, but they'd already agreed that there was going to be no chance of creating a monopoly of violence in the countryside. So they started passing laws facilitating the creation of armed self-defense groups. In 1965, okay? 68, that was all increased. So I think this is very deep-seated, this attitude towards the countryside, and a very privatized model. You know, if I was talking about Africa, I'd say this is indirect rule. You know, the state doesn't rule the countryside. It delegates authority to local elites, local armed groups, different groups, and it manages them and interrelates with them, and they enter into some symbiotic relationship with the national state. Okay? So I think that's very deep-seated. And I would say, you know, thinking about all the violence going down, which it has, you know, which is fantastic, which has enormously improved the quality of life and many other things in Colombia, the violence went down in the past as well. The violence went down in the 1960s, but the fundamental problems that led to it hadn't been solved. And so in the 1970s, it started bouncing back again. And this is before the drug economy. When the FARC was expanding in the 1970s, this had nothing to do with coca or anything else. I understand that coca is like throwing petrol on a fire, but I think the problems are much more fundamental and deep-seated than that. So I'd be very concerned that there's cycles in violence in the past, and unless you solve the real problem, then just as in the past, the problems come back. I always, you know, make a comparison between the National Front and the PRI. You know, if you go back to the roots of the PRI in Mexico in the wake of the revolution, this was also a state-building project. The PRI was a sort of mechanism which was actually quite similar to the National Front. It was meant to kind of integrate all the elites into one institution to kind of pacify them and stop them fighting, and a mechanism for them kind of cohabiting, just like the National Front was. But unlike the National Front, after the Mexican Revolution, Calles and Lázaro Cárdenas did a very good job of pacifying the countryside. This is what the ejido was about, the agrarian reform, the ejido. This was a mechanism for controlling the countryside, and that brought a sort of stability that the National Front was never able to achieve. Even, you know, President Lleras, who was, you know, amazingly competent technically, very committed, working in a very favorable kind of international context, was not able to deliver agrarian reform in Colombia. So, you know, I would be very concerned about, you know, any negotiation with the guerrilla about agrarian reform. What can the state actually deliver in Urabá? Can the state really redistribute land from El Alemán and give it to campesinos in Urabá? I'm very skeptical. So what's been happening now? I think, you know, lots of good things have happened. When I think about what was one of the best policies of the Uribe government, and this was maybe a policy that you yourself were involved in, I think of like the National Consolidation Plan. You know, it was much too much of an engineering sort of approach rather than a political approach. But the National Consolidation Plan was really designed to try to reconstruct state authority, state presence, state legitimacy in rural areas. That was a great idea. I mean, I know Danielle knows a lot about this because he's actually done some evaluation or some investigation of the impact of this policy. But that seems to me to have been exactly the kind of right idea. But my impression is that policy has basically been shelved over the last few years. Last year I was asked to kind of evaluate the successor to this policy, and so it seemed to be completely lacking resources and leadership, and so I declined to do it. So, but I was very concerned that this, which I'd always thought was one of the most sensible policies of the Uribe government. Of course, you have to have the military strategy, but you also need to have some way of reconstructing the authority of the state. Although, as I say, it was a very apolitical type of policy. It was more like this kind of engineering approach. So, has the fundamental kind of politics which underpins this state, the structure of the state in Colombia, changed? I just don't see that. I really don't see that. I understand that after the failed negotiation between the Pastrana government and the FARC, there was a big change in people's perceptions of what likely solutions were in Colombia, and that the endless strategy of sort of, you know, making deals, you know, there was a 10-year attempt to make deals with Pablo Escobar, and at some point it was clear that you couldn't make a deal with Pablo Escobar, and you had to sort the problem out. And I guess this was the perception that finally, you know, you couldn't make a deal with these guys, and you know, you had to sort the problem out. And I think the Uribe government was fantastically successful as that, and I think, as I said earlier, you know, everyone sees the benefits of that in Colombian society. But President Uribe was sort of very driven in some dimensions, but he didn't care at all about other dimensions. And I think he was prepared to be extremely patrimonial in order to get done what he thought needed to be done. But he didn't think there needed to be a larger transformation in the state the way the state worked. He just thought there was this military thing. And that's why these other elements, I think, the consolidation plan, which recognized, as you were saying at the end of your talk, that this is not just about the military. It's much more about the transformation of the state and the transformation of society. And is the peace negotiation going to achieve that? Well, you know, lots of groups demobilized in Colombia. You know, Guadalupe Salcedo demobilized. The EPL demobilized in the 1980s, and Fidel Castaño recruited them all into his paramilitary group. You know, many members of the Autodefensas Campesinas del Magdalena Media were former members of the FARC and the ELN. You know, so lots of groups demobilized. Then they remobilized. You know, in fact, Ramon Isaza demobilized in 1991 during the Gaviria government, and then he remobilized a year later because he said the government couldn't protect us, so we just had to start fighting again. So I think, you know, I think the demobilization of the FARC and peace with the FARC would be a fantastic thing. What are they fighting for? You know, it's mad, you know. So they need to demobilize, and they need to be, yes, I completely agree with that. But I think this is just one small, it makes things easier, you know. It makes a different type of politics easier, perhaps some of my friends think. You know, but it's not the solution to the problem. I just see still enormous problems of the authority of the state, of the patrimonialism of the state, the way the state functions. And it seems to me, you know, that the best scenario for thinking about the negotiation in Havana is that this is a pretext for the Santos government to sort of sell to the Colombian people a much broader transformation of the society. It's not just about, well, you know, we'll make Timoshenko minister of something, and, you know, what do we have to do? You know, it's not about just making a deal. It's about using this as a way of selling to Colombians the necessity of a much broader transformation in the way things work in Colombia. And, you know, and it seems to me the government, you know, I'm sure there's lots of people who don't want that, you know, who don't even think it's necessary. But, you know, according to this interpretation, just the peace negotiation or the demobilization on its own is not going to be sufficient to solve all of these problems. But it is a wonderful opportunity, it seems to me, to put a much broader agenda on the table about the transformation of Colombian society. So.